listen to your fear in the wild, even if you don't understand why you're afraid. It was Mackenzie's idea to go camping. In fact, most things we do start out as one of her ideas. Neither of us was exactly an outdoor enthusiast, but we had both grown up in rural towns and did our share of hiking and fishing growing up. So I wasn't exactly daunted by the idea of spending a few days in the woods, but I wasn't excited either. The school has just let out for spring break. And after another semester of getting kicked by midterms, it was very tempting to give in to my body's desire for a few days of uninterrupted sleep. Uninterrupted sleep, unfortunately, was not Mackenzie's idea of a good time. She had been suggesting the idea to me for weeks beforehand, and I had always brushed her off by claiming I had other things coming up. But by the time the break rolled around, I had run out of excuses, and she had already prepared everything with me in mind. So it was decided, and we left on Sunday. Despite Mackenzie making me wake up before the sun even rose to get on the road, I found myself in a strangely good mood. I had spent most of the previous day either eating or napping, the most uninterrupted rest I had gotten since Christmas. We drove up from Bakersfield. Her truck bathed in the light of the desert sunrise. At first, we spoke of classes and tests, and then of a camping spot that she had found in the forests of the Sierra Nevada. She informed me that it wasn't actually a campground. It was something called dispersed camping, which means you register a permit with Park Services and then pitch a tent wherever you like. Which also meant no water, heat, or electricity. Leave it to Mackenzie to make sure everything we do is to the extreme. By the time the desert scenery had bled into the browns and greens of the Sierra foothills, I had rifled through all of our packs. I trusted Mackenzie with the planning, but now that I realized we were going to be a little more off the grid than previously anticipated, I just wanted to make sure. We each had our own private tents and sleeping bags, along with a few days' supply of food and water. Cooking utensils, first aid kits, and other items were divided up between our two packs, which were already stacked high enough to peek over my head when it was on my back. I recognized landmarks near Sequoia National Park and Kings Canyon, but Mackenzie took us farther north, and I lost track of the terrain. She turned on a trail that led us deeper into the mountains and pulled over when it ended at the foot of a hill. I was out here last week looking around for spots, she said, opening the car door. If we hike around this hill here, there's a sort of little valley with a lake at the bottom where we can set up. I groaned a little as I shrugged off my pack. How long a hike, I asked. I took a step forward and winced at the sound of pots clanging together. Next time I'm packing my own bag, maybe half an hour or so. A little cardio never hurt anyone, I guess, and I bumped the pack higher before tightening the hip strap, trying to keep the weight from dragging on my shoulders. Mackenzie was right just around the hill. The terrain dropped dramatically towards a lake at the center of the valley. Almost like a caldera, I just doubt that there used to be any active volcanoes around these parts. Mackenzie led the way down, through some steep ground where I was worried I might slip and roll, all the way down into the lake. But the firm dirt made good footing, and the trees made good handholds. Mackenzie suddenly stopped, and I heard the rushing of water. I peeked around her shoulder and saw that in front of us lay a stream, almost a small river if I was being generous. It also led towards the lake, but a bend in the trail meant we had to cross it to continue. The snow up in the mountains must have begun to melt, because the stream had swelled in size and the log that lay across it was already submerged by a thin layer of water. Only a few more minutes of walking after we crossed this, Mackenzie said, nudging the log with the toe of her boot. It seemed sound enough despite being underwater. I'd watched out, I said, leaning over the stream. There were tiny ripples at the surface, but it looked placid. They say that streams like these only look calm on the surface. Mackenzie snorted out a laugh and stepped onto the log. Yeah, that's why I don't plan on swimming in it. She began to shimmy across, and after a few moments I shrugged and joined her. It wasn't a far crossing, maybe 20 feet, and we were making fast progress, but in the end, it was always the little things that got you. A little more than halfway across, Mackenzie's foot slipped, and she leaned forward to regain her balance. Her sleeping bag, tied to the top of the pack, broke loose from one of its straps and fell forward over her shoulder until it was caught midair by the remaining strap. That little momentum was enough. Mackenzie tottered for a split second and then fell. I was right, the current was fast. She reached out a hand to grab onto the log, but by the time she resurfaced, she was already too far downstream. I began to scramble across, in hopes of getting to the other side before she was pulled too far away. I guess some luck was on our side that day. The stream was fast, but it wasn't deep, and it couldn't pull her under. Some 20 yards downstream, her pack had caught onto a fallen tree, and that was how I found her, gasping and sputtering. Maybe it was a combination of the adrenaline and the ice-cold water, but by the time we stumbled to the spot where we were going to set up camp, Mackenzie was laughing hysterically. She had rolled her ankle during her stint in the stream and was limping ahead of me while I stumbled after her with her pack, in addition to mine, strapped to me. I don't plan on swimming in it, Mackenzie giggled from ahead of me. And then I fell right into the damn thing. Even I had to smile at that. Despite being stuck with around 60 pounds of supplies, maybe I did need some more action in my life. Now, I really had a story to tell when I got back home. It was just about noon by the time we finished pitching our tents and hanging our wet clothes out to dry. Mackenzie began digging a fire pit to cook our lunch, as we had neglected to bring a jet boiler. I took this moment to take stock of my surroundings and was pleasantly surprised that we found a genuinely beautiful spot to set up camp. We were by the edge of the lake, where the mountains flattened out and the tree line ended a few yards from the shore. After being in school dorms for nearly a year, the amount of quiet was almost uncanny. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the waves breaking against the sand. It was alluring, like a lullaby. Mackenzie cussed beside me, and I looked over. She was struggling to get the fire going. Her hands shook as she tried to light another match. A small pile of used ones already lay by her knee. "Let me try," I said, sitting up. "She almost got pulled away by a stream an hour ago," I reasoned. "Sometimes the shock only hits you after the adrenaline has gone away." I had more luck, and after the fire got going, the rest of the afternoon and evening went by pleasantly. I rummaged through my pack and found that Mackenzie had packed marshmallows and chocolate for s'mores. I tossed the packaging on the ground and jokingly said, "I see my pack was so heavy because it was full of all these essential supplies." Mackenzie grinned and then shrugged innocently. She grabbed the package of marshmallows and began unceremoniously shoving them into her mouth. "Aren't those for cooking?" I asked, and Mackenzie looked up at me with a very well-acted look of confusion. I laughed. When the sun set, both of us agreed to retire early so we could wake up at sunrise to explore the area in the morning. I shimmied into my tent and pulled the zipper closed. I checked my watch one last time before letting the sound of waves lull me to sleep. I woke up in the dark, and something was wrong. The air was heavy, and my skin was clammy, as if I had just broken a fever. Nothing was disturbed inside my tent, and the outside was still quiet. There was nothing reasonable that could have caused this feeling. It's hard to explain. Thinking back on it, the only conclusion I could come to is that we, as a species, are old. Younger than the forests and mountains, of course, but still old enough, and in that time we have seen many things. You can conjure up your life experiences and logic all you want, but deep down there is a part of you that simply knows when something is wrong. And in that moment I knew. Suddenly there was a light tapping on the flap of my tent, and then a voice. "You need to come outside," Mackenzie whispered. And she sounded terrified. I took a few deep breaths and clenched my pocket knife in a white-knuckle grip. In a flurry of motion, I unzipped the flap and stuck my face outside. I came face to face with Mackenzie. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked to be on the verge of tears. I opened my mouth, but she clamped a hand down over my lips and motioned for me to be silent. For a few moments, neither of us spoke, and the only sound to be heard was our heavy breathing as we stared at each other. But then Mackenzie's eyes slowly drifted away from mine, towards the lake. I saw her pupils dilate until I could barely see the color of her eyes. "Run," she whispered. I didn't have time to question her. She leaped up and sprinted into the woods. I didn't waste a second before getting up and following her. The two of us crashed through the undergrowth. Perhaps Mackenzie was clearing the way in front of me because it was strangely easy, or maybe I was simply scared. "Mackenzie," I called to the shape in front of me, but there was no answer, only the sound of her breathing and the cracking of branches. "Mackenzie, what's going on?" Still nothing. And then the adrenaline in my system began to run out, and suddenly I stopped. It was dark, almost too dark to see. We had left all our lanterns back at the camp, and the canopy practically blocked out any moonlight. We'd been running for several minutes, but there were no cuts on me or branches clinging to my hair. It was like I hadn't been forcing my way through the trees at all. It was as if they were welcoming me. Ahead of me, Mackenzie had stopped too. She was standing still, and I couldn't hear her breaths anymore. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice strangely level. "Not until you tell me what's going on," I called back. Mackenzie shook her head. It was even darker where she was standing, and I couldn't make out her face, but behind her was some sort of clearing, and the light coming through silhouetted her against the trees. "We're almost out of the forest," she said, and I saw that she was right. There was nothing I would not give to be out of this God-forsaken forest. But no, it couldn't be. It took us half an hour to hike here, and that was downhill. The forest could not end here. I was being reeled in like a fish chasing a worm on a hook. Mackenzie turned around, and as she did, she took a step towards me, an impossibly huge step. She had been several yards ahead, and now we were almost face to face. I ran. I turned around, and I ran like I was being chased by the devil himself. If the trees had been welcoming on the way in, they were the opposite on the way out. Branches caught on my clothes and cut my arms and face. I kept on stumbling over tree roots and rocks, but I was undeterred. Behind me, I heard her running after me, but it didn't sound like Mackenzie any longer. It sounded like it had 4 legs. I wasn't even tempted to turn around. I was too focused on running, and my eyes stayed locked on the light that marked the end of the tree line. I practically dove onto the beach and fell hard onto my hands and knees. I felt the bones in my wrist crunch at the landing. I continued to crawl until I was almost in the water. Before I turned around, there was nothing there. I wasn't far from our tents, and I watched in wonder as Mackenzie's tent unzipped from the inside, and she stepped out. "What are you doing?" she asked groggily. I ran towards her and practically tackled her into a hug. It was thanks to Mackenzie that we both didn't fall, because at that moment my knees gave out. "There's something in the forest," I said, and to her credit, she immediately grew serious. "Did you see someone?" she asked, scanning the dark line of trees looming over us. "No," I said. "Well, yes, but I don't know," and at that moment I didn't want to tell her what I saw, because speaking of it makes it all the more real. "Something tried to lure me into the forest," I said at length, "but I don't think it's human." Mackenzie just stared at me. For a split second, I thought she was going to call me insane, but it never came. "We need to get to the truck," she said. If she had any questions, she refrained from asking them. "No," I replied, regaining some of my composure. "It wants us in the forest." "We're as good as in the forest right now," Mackenzie reasoned. "The truck is right there. We need to leave." I looked up, and I could see the glint of the truck in the moonlight at the top of the hill. It seemed so close. I outran it. "Once we could do it again, and there'll be 2 of us this time. Once we're there, we'll drive, and we won't stop until this freak show is hours behind us. We could be in Bakersfield by morning." But no, we couldn't. Because the truck is more than a mile away, tucked away behind a hill. We shouldn't be able to see it from here. It was simply impossible. Whatever it was, he was a good hunter, I admit. Good hunters don't chase you with drums and torches. They come at night, and they come quietly, disguised as everything you could want. When you are in the dark, there is light. When you are trapped, they escape. And when you are lonely, they are company. I pushed Mackenzie away. "Why didn't you wake up when I ran into the forest?" I asked. She shrugged, and her facial expression clearly showed that she thought I was being an idiot. "You were quiet," she replied. "But you heard me when I came back." She looked me in the eyes and said, "I guess you were louder." There was a tense moment between us where no one spoke, and then Mackenzie threw her hands into the air in exasperation. "What use is this?" she shouted. "We need to leave." I shook my head and took a step back. "No," I said, "I'm staying here." She looked at me like I had finally gone insane, but I wouldn't budge. Mackenzie took a step toward me, and I flipped my pocket knife open and pointed it at her. She stopped in her tracks and stared at me. You couldn't say she looked surprised. "So, It's going to be like this, huh? I nodded, and the two of us lapsed into yet another silence. After a while, she sat down, and I followed suit. She talked to me all night. At first, she tried to convince me that we needed to leave. She begged me. In fact, she talked about how close the truck was, and how dangerous it was to be out there. Then, as the night dragged on, she spoke of stranger things. She asked me if I was tired, and I didn't reply. "You never have to be tired again," she said. "I don't just mean tonight. What will you do once you leave? Go back to your life. Work. You will be tired for the rest of your life. You will die tired," she said, making a sweeping gesture with her hand that encompassed the expanse of trees behind her. "You can stay here forever," she said. "I promise you will never be tired again." When I didn't answer, she began to speak of her sisters. I knew for a fact that Mackenzie had no sisters. She talked about how they would gather berries for me, and how they would make me a crown of oak leaves to wear. She told me that they stitched clothes with no seams and made fabrics from the foam of the sea. I was in a trance. She painted pictures in my mind of how they would fashion me flutes and harps, and how we would go dancing through the forests during the winter, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. "When you sing," she said, smiling, "the snow will melt, and you will bring in the first flowers of spring." And even so, I did not move, and I did not sleep. Finally, just before dawn broke, Mackenzie stood. "So this is it," and her voice didn't even sound like Mackenzie's anymore. "A marvelous hunt comes to an end," and she bent at the waist in a mock bow before turning around and walking into the woods. "You may leave," she laughed over her shoulder as she melted into the shadows. And her laugh echoed across the valley, making ripples in the water and shaking the trees like the wind. I didn't trust her. I waited until the sun was high in the sky before leaving everything but my knife, and I ran for it. I encountered nothing in the forest on the way back, but I also didn't stop to look. By the time I reached the truck, my legs were burning, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I am not lying when I say I did not touch the brake pedal even once driving out of those mountains. I never looked behind me either. But the trees cast shadows on the ground as I passed them, and just before I reached the edges of the foothills, I swore I saw one in the shape of a woman, and I saw her waving. I called park services in the nearest town and gave them a polished version of what happened. They searched the area and found Mackenzie's body face down in the lake, carried there by the current. I don't know what I pulled out of that stream, but it wasn't her. It might sound twisted, but I was relieved to hear the news. I had thought that, well, maybe Mackenzie had never been there with me, and that it had planned this whole trip from start to finish. I'm still in shock, but I will mourn for my friend when the time comes. I saw the stream. I knew how shallow it was. Mackenzie should not have died, but it killed her. It murdered her, and it would have murdered me. So as beautiful as its words sounded, I did not stay. It has no power outside. It lives in the forests. I will say it again, it lives in the forests, and when you see it, you will know. Whatever you do, don't leave your house after 3 p.m. There's a peculiar rhythm to life in Morton's Grove, a small town nestled deep in the forested valleys of the Pacific Northwest. The sun would peak, casting long shadows over the quaint streets, and by 3 p.m., the town would be eerily silent. Doors would lock, shutters would close, and not a soul would be seen outdoors. It's always been this way, ever since I could remember. Everyone in Morton's Grove abided by this unspoken rule: be inside by 3 p.m. No one ever explained why. The few times I asked my parents, they'd exchange worried glances and change the subject. It's just how things were. It was the only life I knew until I turned 17. I grew restless. The curiosity gnawed at me, an itch I couldn't scratch. What was out there after 3 p.m.? What was everyone so afraid of? On a crisp autumn afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. It was Friday, and school let out at 2 p.m. I told my friends I had something to do, ignored their puzzled looks, and walked slowly home. I kept glancing at my watch, feeling my heartbeat quicken with each passing minute. 2:30, 2:45. I was close to home, but I lingered by the old playground instead. 2:55. My palms were sweaty, and a chill ran down my spine despite the sun's warmth. 3. I waited, expecting something to happen immediately. But there was nothing. The wind rustled the leaves, and a squirrel darted across the road. The silence was unnerving, but it was still just Morton's Grove. I started walking, aimlessly at first, then with more purpose as my confidence grew. The town was mine. I was free. The first thing I noticed was the absence of birds. They'd been chirping all day, but now the silence was absolute. I wandered towards the town square, where the statue of our founder, old Mr. Morton himself, stood solemnly. As I approached, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The shadows seemed longer and the air heavier. I shook it off. It was just my imagination. I was about to turn back when I saw something move at the edge of my vision. A dark figure was slipping between the trees by the old library. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I called out, but my voice sounded small and weak. The figure paused, then disappeared around the corner. Against my better judgment, I followed. As I rounded the corner, I found myself face to face with a creature that defied description. It was humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its skin too pale, and its eyes were hollow voids, darker than any shadows. It stared at me, and I was paralyzed with fear. The thing opened its mouth, and a sound like 1,000 whispers filled the air, drowning out my thoughts. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the pavement and my lungs burning. I could hear it behind me, a soft scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard. I reached my house, fumbling with the keys, and slammed the door shut behind me. My parents were in the living room. Their faces were pale and drawn. "You stayed out," my mother said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," I gasped, my whole body shaking. My father stood, looking out the window. "It's already marked you," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" I asked, but they wouldn't answer. They locked all the doors, drew all the curtains, and told me to stay in my room. The night passed slowly, each minute lasting an eternity. I heard whispers outside my window and soft taps on the glass. I didn't sleep. The next morning I hoped it had been a nightmare, but the fear in my parents' eyes told me otherwise. The town is different now. People avoided me and whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. I wasn't just rebellious, I was cursed. The thing I was, whatever it was, had claimed me. Days turned into weeks, and the fear grew. I saw it everywhere, in reflections, in the corner of my eye, always watching, always waiting. I tried to tell my friends, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. And now, as I write this, the sun is setting. It's 2:55 p.m. I can hear the whispers growing louder, and I feel the dread curling around my heart. I don't know what will happen tonight. Maybe it will finally come for me, maybe it will take me away to wherever it came from. If you're reading this, heed my warning. In Morton's Grove, be inside by 3 p.m. There are things in the shadows that should not be disturbed. I was foolish, and now I pay the price. Whatever happens, don't follow in my footsteps. Stay inside, stay safe, and whatever you do, never be outside after 3 p.m.